Thanks to MPB for sponsoring this video. Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my in-depth review of the Sony A7 V for photography. Yep, a review on YouTube that concentrates on the quality and the performance for stills photos. Pretty radical, huh? If there's demand, I also have a full set of results to make a second review that takes a close look at the video capabilities of the camera, so do let me know if you'd like to see that. But for this review, I've spent over 6 weeks testing the A7 V and directly comparing it against the earlier A7 IV and Canon's EOS R6 Mark III, not to mention the Lumix S1 II. So in this review, you'll find out not just their pros and cons, but see a number of direct comparisons with results that may end up surprising you. It involved a ton of work, but I think it's worth doing, and it's definitely worth watching if you're thinking of dropping the best part of $3,000 on a new camera. So leave any assumptions at the door, sit back and enjoy what's become one of my most in-depth videos to date. First things first, the Sony A7 V is a full-frame mirrorless camera with a 33 megapixel partially stacked sensor, IBIS and up to 30 frames per second burst shooting. There's also uncropped 4K up to 60p and 4K 120 with an APS-C crop, but again, I'm going to leave that to a separate review of the video capabilities if any of you are interested. Announced in December 2025, it comes 4 years after the Mark IV version, which continues in the range at a lower price. The latest Mark V body costs around $2,900 or £2,800, while the Mark IV should settle at around $2,000 or around £1,700. Check my links for the latest deals, as these prices can fluctuate. Now this is a similar approach and pricing to Canon's latest EOS R6 III and their older R6 II, with both being the biggest rivals to the A7 V and the A7 IV respectively. I can't speak for Nikon as they don't send me cameras to test under NDA. So what's new for photographers? The A7 V sensor may share the same resolution as the Mark IV, but its partially stacked design is faster. This allows the Mark V's electronic shutter to shoot bursts up to 30 frames per second. That's 3 times faster than the Mark IV when coupled with Sony's own lenses. But it also supports a blackout-free viewfinder view, 14-bit RAW and pre-capture capabilities, as well as being less susceptible to skewing, all making it much more practical overall. Not only is this one of the biggest upgrades over the A7 IV for photographers, but also a major selling point over Canon's EOS R6 III, at least in specs, which may essentially match the photo resolution and boast faster 40 frames per second bursts, but using a non-stacked sensor that could potentially suffer from greater skewing. But I'm going to show you if that's actually the case in practice very soon. The A7 V also sports Sony's latest autofocus system, first introed on the A7R V, but now integrated into a new image processor. This equips it with more confident detection of humans across more poses and scenarios, along with now recognizing more animals as well as bikes, cars, trains and aircraft. And while the viewfinder spec remains the same as before, the screen is now slightly larger, more detailed, and employs the broader articulation of the A7R V, allowing it to either act as a side-hinged flip and twist, or a vertical tilt that's in line with the optical axis. Meanwhile, Sony also claims the IBIS is improved and there's a bunch of smaller upgrades and tweaks, including twin USB-C ports. But if you don't need faster than 10 frames per second bursts or pre-capture capabilities and find the already very capable autofocus of the Mark IV sufficient, then you could save $1,000 by going for this older model. Or even more if you go for the used market, which brings me to MPB, the sponsor of this video. Now, I've bought and sold used camera gear for many years with MPB, long before they supported my channel here, and I keep returning to them for their simplicity and peace of mind. So when it's time to change gear, I always check them out first for prices on used cameras and lenses that I know I can trust. Unlike some used platforms, MPB is clear about the condition, quoting exactly what it comes with, the shutter count on bodies where available, and posting clear photos from multiple angles. Crucially, MPB also provides a 12-month warranty and a 14-day free return, giving you peace of mind that you won't get from a private sale. And if your budget can stretch to a new A7 V, also consider going for a used Alpha 1 with this former flagship body costing roughly the same on MPB or only a little bit more, while boasting a 50 megapixel stacked sensor. That is a big upgrade in resolution. So whether you're selling anything that you don't need anymore or looking to change gear and buy used from a source that you can trust, check out mpb.com using the link in the description. Right, back to the review. In terms of design, the A7 V looks almost identical to the A7 IV, and as I tested it, many A7 IV owners I spoke to actually mistook it for their camera. From the front, there's only two clues to tell them apart: the smaller AF illuminator window, and the number 7 is now no longer in an indented rectangle. From the top, only their model numbers on the left-hand side are different, and while Sony says that the grip has been modified a little, and the texture is certainly a bit different, they're actually so similar in your hands, I couldn't personally tell any difference. From the back, they also share an identical control layout, and while the screen on the 5 now has a slightly bigger panel and greater articulation, it does look similar when folded back, albeit a fraction thicker and taller than before. Put it this way, if you're familiar with the 4, you're going to be right at home here. This does, however, mean that Sony's resisted the temptation to equip the A7 V with the lockable mode dial of the R5, while the upper left surface of all Alpha 7s remains bereft of anything other than a marker for the focal plane. I realise this is a differentiator with the Alpha 9s and 1s, but I've always felt that the 7s were crying out for another dial on the left hand side. What do you think? But at least this tried and trusted body includes 3 control dials, a positive joystick, an easy way to switch between stills and video without changing the mode dial, and plenty of customization. Note that unlike the Alpha 1s and 9s though, there's no front custom button between the grip and the lens mount, which means you're going to have to assign the newly inherited speed boost function elsewhere, and that may not be quite as convenient to push in operation. Moving on to composition, the A7 V gives you a 3.69 million dot EVF with 0.78 times magnification and a 3.2-inch LCD screen with 2.1 million dots that can tilt vertically or flip out and twist. Turn the camera to the side and see how the information on the menus rotates to stay upright. This also applies when composing through the viewfinder. And I should note that while the Canon R6 III also offers vertical info through its viewfinder, it strangely doesn't offer it when composing with the screen. Also notice the 2D leveling gauge in the viewfinder next to the exposure settings. This provides handy feedback on the horizontal level without obscuring the main view, although you can still have the larger superimposed gauge available if you prefer. In the menus, you'll find the usual grid options now joined by one for the golden ratio. This was actually also added in an A7 IV firmware update, albeit one that was initially withdrawn due to some other compatibility issues. The speed of the partially stacked sensor also allows the viewfinder to display a blackout-free image with minimal or even no perceptible lag when shooting bursts, which certainly makes it easier to follow fast-moving subjects, and I'm going to talk a lot more about that later in the review. Let's now take a closer look at the viewfinder, and you're looking at a clip that I filmed through it. You have the choice of standard or high display quality, as well as standard or high frame rate, the latter switching between 60 and 120 frames per second. Now these settings only impact live composition, and you're unable to combine high quality with high frame rate. Meanwhile, the menus and images in playback always use the high display quality mode. Now at this point, most reviews, having quoted the specs, just move on, but I think it's important to look beyond the specs and actually try to measure any difference in the viewfinder quality modes and how they compare to the competition. So on the left is a photo of the A7 V's live viewfinder display when framing up my resolution chart using the standard quality mode. Let's zoom in for a closer look at the detail, placing this on the left, and on the right in the high quality mode. You can see the high quality mode resolving greater detail with fewer jagged edges. Note the quality of the standard mode on the left is the same you'd see in high frame rate mode, so you should choose between them on detail versus smoothness. As you'd expect, the high frame rate mode was preferable when following fast action, while the high quality mode was sharper for fine details. Note that both modes will consume more power than standard quality with standard frame rate though, so you may want to adjust this to maximise your battery. Oh, and in my test, the older A7 IV's viewfinder looked a tad softer in its standard mode, but essentially matched the A7 V when both were set to high quality. Let's now put the A7 V on the left against the Canon R6 III on the right, both in their standard modes. Here you can see the Canon resolving finer details, but if you now set the A7 V to its best quality mode, they become pretty similar. So Canon drives their viewfinders at the highest resolution in their standard modes, whereas Sony lets you opt in or out to save power. Meanwhile, both operate at a lower quality in their high frame rate modes. Moving on to the screen, the A7 V inherits the panel and mechanism introduced on the A7R5, so you're getting the same 3.2-inch panel with 2.1 million dots and a screen that can either quickly angle vertically up and down in line with the optical axis, or flip out to the side and twist around to face you or back on itself for protection. This combines the best of both articulated worlds, and while you may accidentally tilt the screen a little bit when you want it to flip out, it's a small price to pay for this kind of flexibility. In contrast, both the older A7 IV and the Canon R6 III use side hinge displays which need to be flipped out before you can adjust them vertically, a slower and less discreet process that can't help but annoy street photographers. But what about the panel quality, which in terms of specs sounds like a big step up from the 3-inch 1 million dot screen of the previous A7 IV? Now, rather than just quoting the specs and assuming it's going to be way better, I wanted to actually find out. So I photographed both screens when composing and playing back my resolution chart. So here's the A7 V screen during live view on the left and the older A7 IV screen on the right. Here you can certainly see the new A7 V on the left out-resolving the A7 IV in terms of detail, especially on diagonal or curved outlines and text, although perhaps by not quite as much as you'd expect given double the number of total dots. And just for comparison, let's now swap in the Canon R6 III on the right, which like the A7 IV has a 3-inch screen, but this time with 1.6 million dots. Here, as the numbers suggest, the resolving power is roughly between the A7 IV and the A7 V, but it is still quite a subtle difference. So like sensor resolution, counting the total number of dots implies a bigger difference than the actual linear figures in practice. But any screen upgrade is welcome, and the A7 V now has one of the better displays of its peer group. But why do camera companies continue to fall behind the size, the resolution, and especially the brightness of phone screens? Hasselblad seems to be one of the only companies who are actually interested in evolving camera screen technology. Behind a door on the right hand side of the grip are twin card slots with the same configuration as the A7 IV before it. So you're getting twin SD slots with the upper slot alternatively accommodating faster CF Express Type A cards. Now while it would be nice if both slots supported both SD and CF Express, that feature is reserved for higher end models in the range. And I'd still say that the A7 V solution is more flexible than Canon, as you can use two affordable SD cards for backup if you like. In comparison, the R6 III has one slot for SD and one slot for CF Express Type B only, so if you want to record to both slots for backup, one of them is going to have to be a more expensive CF Express card. That said, Type B CF Express cards are cheaper than Sony's Type A models, so there's always pros and cons to weigh up. Whether you're using the A7 V or R6 III though, I found that the actual card format didn't have that much impact on the burst size, but it certainly did for the speed at which the buffer was subsequently cleared, and I'm going to demonstrate that in the burst section later in the video. Turning to the left side, you'll find the physical ports behind a number of flaps, starting with 3.5mm microphone and headphone jacks, each behind their own flaps. Note how the microphone flap does clear the screen. Sony continues their tradition of fitting a pair of USB ports, allowing you to, say, tether with one while powering with the other, but this time they're both USB-C connectors and also support power delivery for faster charging. As before, they operate at very different speeds though, so while either could be used for data or for charging, you will want to use the top port one for data as it runs up to 10 gigabits per second with USB 3.2, versus port 2 at the bottom, which runs around 20 times slower at 480 megabits per second, and that uses USB 2. You can also use the USB ports for webcam streaming up to 4K 30p, and the camera now also supports 6 GHz Wi-Fi in addition to the more common 2.4 and 5 GHz bands. There's also full-size HDMI, which can output 4K 60p in 10-bit 422, although it will not output raw video to an external recorder. Whoops, I forgot this review is about photography only. And finally, on the top is one of Sony's multi-interface shoes for flashes or other accessories. In terms of battery, the A7 V is unsurprisingly powered by the NP FZ100 pack, but manages to squeeze more life from it with improved power-saving modes, and that includes a more practical sleep and wake-up option. Sony quotes 630 shots using the viewfinder under sleep conditions, which is pretty good, and in use I found it could easily last a whole day of general shooting. If you're after more life, you can use the optional VG C4EM grip, which accommodates two FZ100 batteries and also provides portrait controls. It does occupy the camera's battery compartment with a stalk though, so you'll only have 2 batteries in total. Before moving on to the sensor, a quick note on the lens mount. It is of course compatible with any Sony E-mount lens, but as before, there are restrictions with third-party lenses. Most obviously, there's Sony's usual annoying 15 frames per second burst speed limit when using any third-party E-mount lens with continuous autofocus or AFC. As you'll see later, I confirmed this when using various Sigma lenses, although I was also unable to shoot faster than 20 frames per second with my Sigma lenses, even when set to single AFS mode. Now, this wasn't an issue with the older A7 IV, as the top burst speed on that model was 10 frames per second, whether in mechanical or electronic shutter modes. But now that the A7 V accelerates its electronics burst to 30 frames per second, you're gonna need a Sony lens to enjoy that with AFC, and in some cases, AFS as well. As for general compatibility with third-party brands, I tried the A7 V with a Sigma 20-200, seen here, without any issues other than that burst speed restriction, and likewise for the Sigma 100-400, which you'll see in some of my action examples later. Oh, and here's some other shots that I took with the A7 V fitted with the Viltrox 85mm f1.4 lens with no issues for general use. If you're interested in a deeper dive into third-party lens compatibility though, I'd recommend watching Kai Wong's follow-up video about his experiences with a broader range of brands and models. Okay, now to the business end of the A7 V with its brand new 33MP back illuminated, partially stacked sensor. This may share the same resolution as the A7 IV, but the partially stacked design allows faster readout, which in turn reduces the skewing effect on videos and photos when using the electronic shutter. It's also now coupled with a new Bionz XR2 processor, which combines the previously separate image processing and AI processing chips. Now, as sensors get faster, sometimes dynamic range can be compromised, but Sony's claiming up to 16 stops, at least at 100 ISO, and even the RAW files in the electronic mode now support 14-bit depth. Sony also says they've improved the sensor shift IBIS stabilization. All big claims, so in the following sections I'll be putting all of them to the test. First, a quick look at the quality settings, starting with the choice of recording compressed images as JPEG or two types of HIF. These can be set to 4 different compression levels from light to extra fine, as well as at a choice of 3 resolutions, 33, 14 and 8.2 megapixels, and in a choice of 4 cropped aspect ratios. RAW shooters will notice some differences from the A7 IV with a choice of lossless compressed, compressed HQ, and compressed options on the Mark V. So you'll note there is no longer an uncompressed RAW option, perhaps because of the burst restrictions it previously imposed on the Mark IV, but there is now a new compressed HQ mode. To see how their file sizes compared, I took the same scene in each RAW mode and measured them at 50, 32 and 30 megabytes respectively. Now, it made no difference whether I was using the mechanical or the electronic shutter, and again, electronic RAWs should now record in the same 14-bit depth as the mechanical RAWs. So in terms of file size, the 2 lossy compressed RAW options were actually pretty similar in size and substantially smaller than the lossless RAW version. Sadly, I can't evaluate any differences in quality yet, as at the time of making this video, Adobe had only added support for the lossless RAW file format. So Lightroom and Photoshop users should stick to this format for compatibility. As I'll show in a moment though, there were differences in burst depth between the 3 RAW formats, with the compressed mode allowing me to capture almost 3 times more frames than the lossless or the compressed HQ modes at the fastest speeds. Scrolling through the quality menus, you'll find a pair of composite RAW modes, which allow you to capture a sequence of images to reduce noise or generate an HDR photo. Note that both require you to process the files externally using Sony's free Imaging Edge application, and this also offers a resolution enhancement option for single RAW files. But note, there is no in-camera pixel shift mode to boost the resolution on the A7 V. Interestingly, Canon is also moving away from pixel shift options on their latest cameras, leaving the mode to rival brands. And of these, only Panasonic will actually assemble the composite in-camera, allowing you to evaluate the result in the field. Right, let's now have a look at the image quality. I'll start with a brief look at the resolution, as the A7 V, A7 IV and Canon R6 III should now all be essentially much the same, but it is worth confirming while also taking the opportunity to show some alternative approaches. So here's my resolution chart taken with the Sony A7 V and GM2470 Mark II zoom at 50mm in RAW and converted using Adobe Camera Raw using sharpening settings of 50, 0.5, 36 and 10, and with noise reduction set to 0, and I'm going to use these same settings for all of the other converted RAW files in this test. So let's take a closer look at the finest converging lines and place the A7 V on the left, with the older A7 IV on the right for comparison. Both look almost identical here as expected, with moire entering the vertical resolution lines at much the same point and staying mostly away from the horizontal resolution lines. So for pure photo resolution, the A7 V looks essentially the same as the A7 IV. If you want a big boost from Sony, you're going to need to go for something like an Alpha 1 or an A7R V. Now let's switch the A7 IV result on the right for the Canon EOS R6 III, which, as expected, shares essentially the same extinction points, albeit avoiding most of the moire in the vertical resolution lines, presumably due to a different approach to low-pass filters. Now let's switch the R6 III on the right for the Lumix S1 II, a camera at a roughly comparable price. Here you can see the lower resolution 24 megapixel sensor resolving less detail in this test, as expected, but wait, the Panasonic has a trick up its sleeve. So let's now switch it for the pixel shifted version, which captures a bunch of images shifted fractionally by the sensor IBIS mechanism before then compositing them into a higher resolution result. This is all done in camera, and as you can see is able to effectively boost the resolution on static subjects beyond the native 33 megapixels of the A7 V. Great for archive or still life work. But while Sony and Canon appear to have abandoned pixel shift on their latest bodies, they have both adopted software resolution enhancements. So let's keep the Lumix S1 II pixel shifted result on the right, but now switch the A7 V native result on the left for the resolution enhanced version generated from a raw file in Sony's Imaging Edge application. You can now see the Sony on the left come quite close to matching the resolution of the pixel shifted Lumix. I'd say the Lumix on the right is still a cleaner result, and of course is based on actual reality versus the interpolated or assumed result on the left. But it is quite close for this subject, and of course can be applied to any raw file you have, while also avoiding motion artifacts. But this approach isn't unique to Sony. Canon also has resolution enhancers, as do third parties. So let's now switch the Lumix S1 II pixel shifted result on the right for the Canon R6 III, upscaled using Adobe Camera Raw's Super Res mode. Here the lines look a little less distinct than the Sony and Lumix, but this is more down to contrast, and if you compare the actual resolved details, I'd say they're looking quite similar. So there are ways to enhance the resolution of all cameras, but I'm still giving bonus points to Panasonic here for including a pixel shift mode that not only boosts the potential resolution based on actual reality, but can perform the composite process in camera and spit out a JPEG and a RAW file if you like. Now just before moving on, here's a quick shot that I took with the A7 V showing Brighton Pier. It's a RAW file processed in Adobe Camera Raw with the same settings as above, so with 50, 0.5, 36 and 10 sharpening and no noise reduction. Let's zoom in for a closer look, placing the standard RAW at the top and comparing it against the same RAW file but processed in Sony's Imaging Edge software using their resolution enhanced option. I've put that one at the bottom. Now, as you already know, this is just interpolating using software, but it's doing so quite intelligently and quite effectively too. Not only are jagged edges smoothed out as you'd expect, but moire has been reduced and some very fine details are more easily resolved. For example, some of those distant chimneys which are mashed together in the original are now more clearly separated. Again, the benefit of software enhancement is you can apply it to any file in the future, and these tools will only get better. Obviously the results can vary, and it's not going to be as good as a native high-resolution sensor that's capturing actual real-life detail, but it can still provide an effective boost. Now let's move on to noise, and for this comparison I've photographed a bunch of flowers with each camera at all of their sensitivities. For a level playing field and to see what's going on under the hood, I've used RAW files here, all taken with the mechanical EFC shutter and all converted using Adobe Camera Raw with the same sharpening settings, again at 50, 0.5, 36 and 10, and with all noise reduction turned off. As such, you're going to see a lot of visible noise artifacts as the sensitivities increase, but I wanted to show you what each camera gives you to work with. Out-of-camera JPEGs and normally processed RAW files will of course look much cleaner. As I doubled each ISO value, I also halved the shutter speed, and these were also matched with each camera so the exposures should remain consistent. So if you see the image change brightness, that indicates varying actual sensitivity in practice. I also locked the white balance from the 100 ISO conversions upwards, so look out for any shifts at higher ISOs. Anyway, now that we're zoomed in for a closer look, let's put the A7 V on the left and the earlier A7 IV on the right, running between the extended low and high sensitivities of 50 and 204,800 ISO respectively. I'd say both cameras are looking pretty clean from 50 to 400 ISO, with only the faintest noise at 800 ISO. At 1600 ISO onwards, there's more noticeable noise at each subsequent stop, and by 6400 ISO, each camera exhibits slightly different noise artifacts. The older A7 IV looks a little noisier, but the A7 V is a fraction more smeared in some areas. Maybe the 5 is applying some additional noise reduction at the raw level that we have no control over. Ultimately though, I'd rank them similarly, which is reassuring as it appears the A7 V is delivering similar noise levels despite having a partially stacked design. Now let's keep the A7 V on the left and compare it against the Canon EOS R6 III on the right. The Canon also offers an extended low of 50 ISO, but tops out at 102,400 ISO. Interestingly, this is actually one stop lower than the older R6 II. I'd say again both cameras are looking quite similar, especially towards the lower sensitivities, with noise faintly appearing from 800 ISO onwards and only becoming more obtrusive at around 3200 to 6400 ISO. There is a big drop from both cameras at 25,600 ISO though, and in some areas the Canon looks like it's exhibiting slightly higher chroma noise. And at 51,200 ISO onwards, the Sony is arguably a tad cleaner, but it is a close run thing even when pixel peeping, with both models able to clean up to a similar degree. And now let's compare the A7 V against the Lumix S1 II on the right, which shares the same extended sensitivity range. Notice throughout the range though how the Lumix samples are looking a tad darker when both cameras are using identical exposures and raw conversions, suggesting that the Lumix is slightly less sensitive at each reported ISO value. Again, both cameras are pretty clean up to 800 ISO, with more visible noise artifacts appearing from 1600 ISO onwards. By 12,800 ISO, I'd say the S1 II is looking a little noisier, and this continues with each stop of sensitivity. Again though, this is serious pixel peeping, and based on these results, I wouldn't personally choose one of these four cameras over the other. All will clean up to a similar degree. As mentioned earlier, the A7 V also offers a composite raw noise reduction mode, which takes either 4, 8 or 16 raw files in a burst, which are then assembled into a single file with lower potential noise. This composite process is performed using Sony's Imaging Edge software, which can identify groups of raw files in your folders. You can see it here identifying this raw file as the first of 4 in a composite sequence, and that allows you to then highlight the ones you need before setting the software off to do its thing. To compare the quality and potential for noise reduction, I tried the 4, 8 and 16 frame composite NR modes at 12,800 ISO versus a single shot at 12,800 ISO, the latter processed in Imaging Edge using its extended noise reduction option. So here's how they looked. So as before, I'll zoom in on a portion with the single frame on the left, first compared to the 4 frame composite NR version on the right. Here I'd say that while the 4 frame composite exhibits less noise in the shadow areas, it does look more processed and slightly less natural than the finer noise grain of the single frame on the left. Which you prefer is down to personal preferences though, and I suspect by the time YouTube has done its own compression, you may be looking at slightly different looking results. Next, I'll swap the 4 frame composite on the right for the 8 frame version, and this time there is a visible reduction in the noise. Again, pixel peeping shows some processing artifacts, but it is cleaner overall. And finally, for the 16 frame version on the right, where the result has become cleaner and smoother still, with no loss of detail in the more complex areas. So it is quite subtle in this particular example, but the composite raw noise reduction modes can certainly deliver a cleaner result depending on the subject and the conditions. Next, for dynamic range, and as always I want to show you a real life subject taken with multiple cameras moments apart with the same exposure settings and raw conversions. Now, charts are great for measuring precise differences and generating endless discussions about them online, but what I want to do is see what it all means in practice with an actual landscape view. So I photographed bright and peer with each camera in RAW using exactly the same shutter speed, aperture and 100 ISO sensitivities, and with their mechanical EFC shutters. I actually mounted the A7 V and Canon R6 III on the same bracket, allowing me to capture the same moment with each before then switching to the A7 IV and R6 II, and then the Lumix S1 II after that. Now the peer represents quite a challenge, as when the top side is correctly exposed or you're trying to preserve the highlights in the sky, the structure underneath becomes lost to dark shadows. So I wanted to see how much detail I could recover from each camera and how noisy they looked afterwards. As you can see in Adobe Camera Raw, the A7 V RAW file appears to respond well to lifting shadows or reducing highlights, but how about versus its rivals? I'm going to increase the exposure by 3 stops in Adobe Camera Raw on the files from each camera. I'll turn off noise reduction and compare the results. So here's the processed RAW file, and since I've applied 3 stops to the whole composition, some of the brighter areas are now looking a bit blown out. But let's take a closer look at the shadows while also trying to dodge some of those spray marks from the stormy sea. Yeah, that's the downside to using a real life subject. So you're looking at the A7 V on the left and the A7 IV on the right. When using the exact same exposures and raw processing settings, the A7 V image on the left looks cleaner to me with higher contrast, crisper details, and a little less noise and a more natural appearance. Again, maybe there's some processing going on with the raw file before it's recorded, but ultimately I think the A7 V result does look better. Certainly it's not looking worse, which is the major concern when going from non-stacked to partially stacked sensor technology. So let's now keep the A7 V on the left and switch the result on the right to the Canon EOS R6 III. I'd say the Canon result has similar shadow detail, but more visible noise. Remember, I've turned noise reduction completely off for these comparison images to see what information there was to work with afterwards. Again, the A7 V on the left looks like the raw data may have had some processing applied in camera before the file was recorded, but again, the bottom line is it's looking cleaner given the same post-processing settings. That said, looking at the actual detail, I think it would be possible to bring images from either camera to much the same level. So from this result, I'd say they're looking very similar from a shadow recovery viewpoint. And finally, let's swap the R6 III result out for the Lumix S1 II, which like my earlier noise results is looking darker and more contrasty given the same exposure and post-processing. To be fair, it was taken a couple of minutes later, so the conditions weren't absolutely identical, but there is quite a difference in the look of the image here. But in terms of shadow recovery, there is a similar amount of detail, especially if you boost the Lumix exposure a bit in post by another stop, and the result is pretty clean. I also made some comparisons between the mechanical EFC and fully electronic shutters on the A7 V, and I found no difference in dynamic range at 100 ISO when lifting shadows in a real-life subject to a similar degree, and that's pretty good. And finally, here's those original files from the A7 V and Canon R6 III again, this time processed with the exposure slider set to 0, but with the highlight and shadow sliders at their maximum values. Again, remember both shots were taken at the same time. These represent an extreme example of what someone might do with a file while attempting to recover both shadow and highlight detail, and apart from a different white balance, even though both files were set to the same temperature and tint during processing, the recovered detail is looking similar. Both cameras have retrieved the same wispy clouds on the horizon on the left, and the same details under the shadowy belly of the pier. I show this again as while the chart may reveal subtle differences between cameras for endless online reproduction and analysis, once you actually take them into the field and start taking actual photos, those differences may not be as significant as you thought. Now your mileage will vary, but from my results here, I'd rank the A7 V and R6 III very similarly in terms of practical dynamic range and what you can do with those files. And that, dear viewer, is the value of doing real-life testing with products side by side. Let's now take a closer look at the shutter types and their impact on rolling shutter and bursts. From the menu, you can choose between mechanical or fully electronic. If you choose mechanical, you can separately choose whether the camera employs an electronic front curtain or not, so you should be covered for all preferences. When set to mechanical, the fastest shutter speed remains 8 thousandths of a second, while at the other end of the range you can dial in up to 30 seconds. The top burst speed with a mechanical shutter also remains 10 frames per second, albeit now with no restrictions when shooting in the various RAW formats. Lest we forget, the previous A7 IV only shot at 6 frames per second in lossless or uncompressed RAW modes. Meanwhile, the top flash sync speed when using the mechanical shutter is 2/50th of a second or 3/20th if you're in the cropped APS-C mode. Long exposure fans will appreciate the bulb timer, which lets you preset exposures of 2 to 900 seconds. Handy, although I still think that Fujifilm's approach is simpler, where you just keep turning the shutter dial to go beyond the arbitrary limit of 30 seconds all the way up to 15 minutes. Now, I'm not complaining too much though, as a bulb timer is still a fairly recent feature for Sony, so I'm just pleased that it's here. Set to the electronic shutter, the A7 V now doubles its fastest shutter speed to 16 thousandths of a second, a very handy boost over the old A7 IV, which stopped at 8 thousandths of a second when using either shutter type. Sure, it may not go as fast as the 32 thousandths of a second of some brands, but it's still very useful to have when trying to deploy fast apertures in bright conditions without ND filters. Meanwhile, the electronic shutter receives a substantial upgrade in burst speed, tripling from 10 to 30 frames per second, while also offering an optional pre-capture mode. Again, you'll need one of Sony's own lenses to support the fastest burst speeds, but I can confirm that pre-capture worked with the Sigma lenses I tried, albeit at 15 frames per second. Okay, before testing the burst and pre-burst modes, let's take a look at the rolling shutter, as super fast bursts and pre-capture features can become moot if they suffer from terrible skewing. Now, these first tests panning past a bottle were made at a focal length of 35mm. So first, here's some pans made with the A7 V's mechanical shutter at 10 frames per second, where, as you'd expect, the bottle is vertical. Next, here's the A7 V and its electronic shutter at 30 frames per second, where you'll first notice smaller increments between each frame due to the faster speed. But as the bottle goes past, notice how it is now slanting a little bit vertically, and that's an undesirable effect of rolling shutter. As my pan decelerates, you'll see that skewing effect reduce. So place the mechanical version on the left and the electronic version on the right, and the first thing to conclude is the A7 V's new sensor is not immune to the rolling shutter effect. Of course it isn't, it's not global, but the important part is how it compares to other models. So here's some pans made with the older A7 IV using its electronic shutter, which here is firing at its top speed of 10 frames per second, so you're going to notice coarser increments than the A7 V, due to the slower speed, but as soon as the bottle comes into view, there is a way more pronounced skewing effect. Really whip the camera from side to side and its Achilles heel becomes particularly apparent. And this isn't an unreasonable test either, as panning to follow, say, a racing car or a bird in flight will have a similar effect, especially as it becomes more obvious at longer focal lengths. So let's put the A7 V on the left and the A7 IV on the right, both using their electronic shutters, where it's clear that while both can suffer from skewing, the A7 V represents a huge improvement over its predecessor. Great news, but how about the competition? I actually captured my A7 V results with the camera mounted on a bracket alongside the Canon R6 III in order to make a true side-by-side comparison under identical conditions. So let's play back some pans taken with the R6 III, here at 40 frames per second using its electronic shutter. Now remember, this is an unstacked sensor versus the partially stacked sensor of the A7 V, but while it's unsurprisingly again exhibiting some skewing, is it that much different from the new Sony? So here's the Sony A7 V on the left and the Canon R6 III on the right, both captured at the same moment from the same rig, so the sideways motion is the same. I'd previously adjusted each camera to point directly at the bottle, and at this point in the sequence it was in front of both and in the middle of each frame, so it's as fair a comparison as I can make here. And the end result is, well, they're looking pretty similar here, which may not be what you were expecting. Again, I realise that numbers, timings and charts can illustrate precise differences between them, but what I wanted to show here is what it all means to you when you're shooting in practice. Under these conditions, the A7 V may represent a big improvement over the A7 IV in terms of electronic rolling shutter, but it's actually very similar to the R6 III here. But this is just one test. I also photographed birds in flight with both cameras at focal lengths up to 400mm with quick pans, and while both again exhibited skewing under the toughest conditions, I did find that the A7 V delivered slightly better results than the R6 III, but only slightly. That said, while the R6 III may shoot faster electronic bursts than the A7 V, the Sony may end up being more practical overall. Remember, you're getting 14-bit RAW files with the A7 V's electronic shutter versus 12-bit on the Canon, and as you'll see, there's way more pre-capture options on the Sony. Not to mention a speed boost option that can accelerate to a faster speed while you hold another button like a shift key. Ultimately, A7 IV owners will notice a big reduction in skewing, but if you want to reduce this effect further beyond either the A7 V or R6 III, you're going to need to invest in a camera with either a fully stacked sensor, a global sensor, or of course just shoot mechanically and accept the slower speed and the lack of pre-capture facilities. Let's now take an in-depth look at the burst performance and pre-capture features. I timed bursts of JPEG and all three RAW types at the top speeds for both the mechanical and the electronic shutters, and with both SD and CF Express cards, and for good measure with both Sony and third-party lenses. Phew, here are the highlights. First things first, when comparing SD and CF Express cards on the Sony, I measured similar results for speed and burst depth, give or take a few frames, but substantially different write times afterwards, especially for the most demanding formats. To illustrate this, here's a burst taken in lossless compressed RAW using the fastest electronic shutter, first with a CF Express card fitted. When I let go of the shutter, notice how the top left corner indicates 30 frames left to right. This process takes just over 3 seconds to complete, so about 10 frames written every second. Now for the same conditions, but with an SD card fitted. Again, a similar burst depth, albeit with 36 frames to write at the end. This time that took just over 8 seconds to fully clear the buffer, so that's about 4 frames written every second, or less than half the speed of the CF Express card. So the moral, as you already knew, is to use CF Express cards for the most responsive experience when shooting bursts. You're going to get your full buffer back in less than half the time compared to using SD, and in some of my tests even faster still. Okay, now for some timings, all using a Sony lens, continuous AFC mode, and a CF Express card to avoid any restrictions. For JPEGs alone, I could shoot pretty much indefinitely with the mechanical EFC shutter at 10 frames per second, and the buffer cleared almost instantly. Switching to the electronic shutter at 30 frames per second, I managed just over 200 frames before the camera began to slow down, so that was about 7 seconds of continuous shooting, and afterwards only a couple of seconds to clear the buffer. Next for the 3 RAW formats, first with a mechanical EFC shutter, where again I could shoot pretty much indefinitely at 10 frames per second, with the buffer only taking a second or two to clear after each 10-second test burst. Switching to the electronic shutter at 30 frames per second though, you're gonna notice some big differences with the RAW files. I managed to capture 37 frames using the lossless compressed RAW mode before the speed fell to about 10 frames per second. With the camera set to the new compressed HQ RAW mode, I was able to capture 37 frames again, before again slowing to around 10 frames per second. But when set to compressed RAW, I was able to capture 98 frames, shooting for almost 3 times longer, before again slowing to 10 frames per second. So if you want the longest RAW burst at 30 frames per second, then compressed RAW is the mode to go for, and when using a CF Express card, the buffer then took 2 to 3 seconds to fully clear. Just for comparison, I then switched to an SD card and managed 86 frames at 30 frames per second before the camera slowed to 10 frames per second. So again, the same top speed and a similar depth, but it took just under 12 seconds to fully write onto the slower card format. I then repeated my test, but with the Sigma 100-400 DG/DN zoom fitted. With the focus set to continuous AFC and the electronic shutter set to the top speed, I measured 15 frames per second as expected, so that's half the maximum that's possible with a Sony lens. But out of curiosity, I also tried it in single AFS mode to see if I could unlock the top 30 frames per second speed, but strangely I only measured 20 frames per second rather than the expected 30. Now there may be various combinations or factors that resulted in this, but the bottom line is if you want the maximum speed from the A7 V, you're going to need to pair it with a Sony lens. While there are restrictions with the A7 V though, there's fewer than with the older A7 IV. Lest we forget, on the A7 IV, 10 frames per second was only available for JPEG and compressed RAW, while the latter only allowed that with CF Express cards. And when shooting in uncompressed or lossless compressed, the top speed fell to 6 frames per second in my tests. In stark contrast, I was able to enjoy 30 frames per second in any of the file formats on the A7 V, and when using SD cards too, so it's become not only faster overall, but a lot less fussy on those settings too. Meanwhile, Canon's EOS R6 III sports faster bursts for both its shutter types, confirmed in my tests. I was able to shoot seemingly unlimited bursts of JPEG or RAW with mechanical EFC shutter at 12 frames per second, with the buffer writing almost immediately. Using its electronic shutter, I captured 206 JPEGs in just over 5 seconds, so a similar number to the A7 V, but at a faster speed of 40 frames per second. Set to RAW, I managed 119 files, a few more than the 98 I captured on the A7 V, but again faster too at 40 frames per second. In the RAW test, it took 7.5 seconds to fully write those 119 files onto a CF Express card, or 20 seconds to write a similar 117 frame burst onto SD. Now, one of the most useful features of shooting electronically is being able to implement a pre-capture mode. This keeps a rolling buffer of the most recent frames while you half press the shutter release button, but only commits them to memory once you fully push down. This means the camera is able to record images taken a split second before you react, allowing you to capture unpredictable action, like the moment a bird takes flight or perhaps a player makes contact. It's a major upgrade on the A7 V over the A7 IV, and while Canon's R6 III also offers pre-capture capabilities at its faster top speed, Sony's implementation may actually be more practical overall. Most usefully, on the A7 V, you can choose the pre-capture time from as long as 1 second to as short as 0.03 seconds. You can also slow down the electronic burst speed versus the Canon, which only offers its pre-burst speed at the fastest 40 frames per second and only records the last quarter to half a second in my tests. Here's an example of pre-burst in action on the A7 V, here using the Sigma 100-400 DGDN of 400mm 6.3. Now, this lens did limit the camera to 15 frames per second when using AFC, but it still allowed me to grab fine increments between each and crucially grab the moment when Steven Seagal here was disturbed from his spot. Pre-burst effectively lets you rewind to the moments you weren't quick enough to react to in person. I also found pre-burst useful when capturing waves splashing against a break during a storm. Here it's let me wait a second to see if the action was worth capturing before then pushing down fully on the shutter button and knowing that I'd have all of the action in the bag from the moment that the wave first struck. Here I was shooting at the full 30 frames per second using a Sony lens. So the Sony A7 V may only shoot at 3/4 the top speed of the Canon, but it offers longer and more adjustable pre-capture options. Moving on to stabilization, the A7 V of course features sensor shift IBIS, which Sony now claims is good for up to 7.5 stops in the center or 6.5 stops towards the edges. Compare that to the A7 IV, which claimed 5.5 stops. I always put these claims to the test though, so I shot the same still life scene with the 24-70 GM2 at 70mm, using progressively slower shutter speeds to see when the result became blurred with and without IBIS enabled. Remember, this is an unstabilized lens. With IBIS SteadyShot enabled, the slowest shutter speed that I could handhold a sharp result at 70mm was 1/10 of a second. Compare this to the same exposure without SteadyShot and the difference is dramatic. The slowest shutter speed I required for a perfectly sharp result without SteadyShot under the exact same conditions was 1/160th of a second. So in this particular test I measured 4 stops of compensation. Coincidentally, this was actually similar to the 3 to 5 stops that I measured with the A7 IV previously, but your mileage will of course vary. Quick side note though, it may be an older feature, but I still like how Sony's auto ISO can be configured to use slightly faster or slower shutter speeds for those who find they either need a bit more help to combat shake under certain conditions or who are feeling particularly steady. Moving on to autofocus, the A7 V inherits Sony's latest subject detection and tracking algorithms, which are a substantial step up over the A7 IV in terms of what it will recognise and under which conditions. Before even looking at subject recognition though, the A7 V also inherits the broader array of single AF area sizes from extra large to extra small, along with the chance to adjust 3 custom zone shapes. Delve into the recognition target menu and you can select auto to let the camera figure out what it's looking at, or manually choose between human, animal, bird, insect, car, train or aeroplane. Each of these is highly customizable, including auto, which lets you ignore, say, insect and aeroplane if you're unlikely to encounter either in general use. And as you refine the selection, the camera becomes quicker and more accurate at recognizing the subject. As before, you can also register a number of faces that can be prioritized over others, for example the hosts of an event, although this mode doesn't work with the subject detection set to auto. Now, Sony's subject recognition and autofocus is often declared the best around on many videos, but as always I wanted to test it side by side with Canon's EOS R6 III to see if either actually enjoyed a visible lead over the other. So here are both cameras, literally side by side, both fitted with native lenses at 35mm 2.8 with continuous AFC, known as servo AF on the Canon, and using the full area first with the subject detection set to auto. This was using the default setting, so all possible subject types are being looked out for. You'll notice both cameras immediately locked onto my eye when facing them, choosing the closest eye in each case. Likewise, no problem with the side profile, and as I turn, both mostly continue to track the back of my head with a box, before refining to an eye when facing. Removing my hat seems to allow the Sony to stay locked onto an eye for longer, although when I'm fully turned away, the Sony loses the subject recognition box, albeit still identifies me as a target. Both reacquire my eye at around the same point. As I turn and walk away, the Sony loses me for a few steps, while the Canon stays locked onto the back of my head. Once I'm at the furthest point of my garden though, and facing the camera, both are picking up my face. As I walk back and forth across my garden, the Canon stays consistently locked to my head, while the Sony switches between head, torso and unrecognised. From a mid-distance though, both are doing a good job at tracking my head or my eye when facing forward. Again though, with my hat back on, the Sony loses me as a recognised subject as I turn away, while the Canon stays more confidently locked to my head. So with auto subject recognition, I'd say the Canon is a little more confident overall for a human subject under these conditions. But when the subject's facing forward or in profile, both are performing at a fairly similar level. How about when both cameras are set to human only as the subject type? Here, both cameras lock onto my eye when facing the camera and turn to profile, but again the Sony is stickier on my eye as I turn away, although again the Sony forgets that I'm a human when I'm fully turned away versus the Canon which keeps a box over my head. Later when my hat is removed, the Sony still fails to recognise the back of my head as human, thanks for that, although maybe that's just me being an entitled white male. Again, as I walk away towards the back of the garden, the Canon stays locked onto the back of my head, versus the Sony which loses me entirely for a few paces before then reacquiring me. But hang on, what's this? The Canon's torso rectangle briefly decides to check out the top of the frame before then reacquiring me. But both cameras do find my head and stay with it at the longest distances here, with the Sony only briefly losing me as I turn away. And from roughly the middle distance onwards, both switch from the full face to a more refined eye, although again the Sony does seem to struggle at times recognising me when turned away. This is of course just one test with one person in one environment, but it's useful nonetheless in illustrating how both Sony and Canon are actually quite similar in recognition when someone is facing them, but that the Canon is consistently better at staying locked on as I turned away. To be fair, the Sony easily reacquired me the moment that it saw an eye in profile, and that's what counts, but in terms of stickiness and continued recognition, the Canon proved more confident here. I also found the auto modes on both cameras worked a treat, and as seen here were almost identical in success with humans as the actual dedicated human mode was. For general day-to-day use, I was very happy to leave both cameras set to auto subject recognition and only drill down under very specific scenarios like a portrait or a wildlife session. What about more demanding subjects like birds in flight with longer lenses? I'm now going to show you a bunch of bursts that I took with the A7 V using either the old FE70-200 f4 Mark I or the Sigma 100-400 DGDN. All of the bursts here were using the electronic shutter at the fastest possible speed with continuous AF, so that means 30 frames per second with the Sony lens and 15 with the Sigma. Most of these bursts had pre-capture enabled, and I also experimented with subject detection modes and AF areas. I also had the Canon EOS R6 III with similar lenses for direct comparison. In terms of subject recognition and tracking, the Sony A7 V did a great job with the birds in flight, placing boxes over them when they were fairly small on the frame, and following them fairly accurately as they passed in front of or behind a variety of backgrounds and obstacles. Now I did find that the Canon R6 III recognised them as birds when they were a little smaller on the frame than the Sony, but not enough to make a significant difference in practice when they're flying so fast in this scenario. You're going to enjoy loads of keepers with either system. As I swung around both cameras to follow the action, I noticed the A7 V's viewfinder delivered feedback with little or no delay. In contrast, some mirrorless cameras in live view suffer from a little lag where their viewfinders display the photo you just took as opposed to what's actually happening right now. This can make it quite challenging to follow a fast subject. But I say some cameras, as while there was definitely a tiny amount of lag on the Canon R6 III, the high frame rate of 40 frames per second really minimises this effect. So yes, the blackout-free viewfinder of the A7 V was ultimately preferable, but the R6 III remains a world apart from lesser models. In terms of rolling shutter, you'll have already seen a little skewing in some of these examples as I pan across buildings. This of course becomes more noticeable as focal lengths increase, and the A7 V is clearly not immune to it. But when shooting at similar focal lengths and panning speeds with the Canon R6 III, I did find that the Sony exhibited a little less skewing. Ultimately, this combination of an essentially lag-free viewfinder coupled with fractionally less skewing on the Sony proved preferable to the faster bursts and more distant subject recognition of the Canon. Plus the Sony is giving you those 14-bit RAW files in electronic mode. My biggest take home here is I see so many people claiming Sony's AF is the best around, but that's just not the case. It's certainly one of the best around, but in some tests you'll find that Canon's latest bodies will outperform it. Overall, I'd rank them similarly in terms of autofocus. Both have got amazing AF systems, and if you're upgrading within the Sony system, you're going to enjoy big benefits over the A7 IV and especially over earlier models. Alongside bursts in the drive mode menu, you'll also find the self-timer and bracketing options. Exposure bracketing is available in single or continuous bursts with 5 frames up to 3 EV apart, 7 frames at 2 EV apart, or 9 frames at 1 EV apart. Next comes focus bracketing, which lets you choose the step size between shots and the number of shots in your bracket, as well as the order and the shooting interval. Now the latter is important as it allows you to set a delay from 1 to 30 seconds to let vibrations settle or to recharge a flash. And the good news is, unlike Canon, you can choose between a mechanical or electronic shutter for focus bracketing on the Sony, and the former does allow you to use flashes, which I know is important for some macro photographers. But weirdly, even if you choose the shortest shooting interval, the process can take some time to complete. Here I've selected a 20 frame bracket with the electronic first curtain mode and the shortest interval time. So let's see how long it takes. Okay, that took about 6 seconds in all, so the camera was shooting at about 3 frames per second. Is this a mechanical shutter issue? Let's repeat the test, but this time with the fully electronic shutter instead. It's quieter for sure, as you'd expect. Silent in fact, with the volume turned down, but again it took 6 seconds to capture those 20 frames, again meaning a rate of 3 frames per second. In contrast, while Canon's focus bracketing employs the electronic shutter only, it will fire the burst at speed, which in the case of the R6 III means those 20 frames are captured in just a second. With the aid of stabilization, this in turn actually allows you to attempt handheld focus bracketing, which sounds crazy at first but can actually be surprisingly useful for jittery subjects like insects. My friend and fellow YouTuber Ben Harvey demonstrated this in one of his recent videos, where handheld focus bracketing allowed him to quickly and easily grab some excellent macro shots of insects in the field. As importantly, Canon also offers an option to stack those images in camera, which lets you check your results again in the field before you get home. Now you can still stack them manually back home if you like, but the in-camera stack may already be good enough. Meanwhile, Sony still expects you to do all your image processing externally, which feels a bit at odds with their messages of speed and power. Wrapping up the other modes for photography, the A7 V includes an interval timer for up to 9,999 frames at intervals of 1 to 60 seconds, with an initial delay of up to 99 minutes. You can use it with mechanical or electronic shutter modes. But what's this? Still no multiple exposure mode? Discontinued emission, unless I blindly missed it, sorry if I did, remains an unusual part of the Sony experience. Yes, I know you can superimpose and overlay images to your heart's content in software afterwards, but you're not getting the chance to see the composite so far in the field to help with reframing, and this is something that pretty much every other company offers. And that, dear viewer, brings me to my final verdict, during which I'll show more sample images taken with the A7 V. Remember, this is going to be a verdict based on the photo capabilities. There's no doubt about it, the Sony A7 V is a tremendous camera, delivering some of the best performance and features in its peer group, while greatly improving on the A7 IV in some key respects. Compared to the A7 IV, the biggest upgrade of course regards speed, with the new partially stacked sensor not only firing electronic bursts up to 3 times faster with optional pre-capture and a blackout-free viewfinder, but crucially with greatly reduced rolling shutter. Lest we forget, the A7 IV sensor suffered from pronounced skewing effects, greatly limiting the practicality of its electronic shutter. To be fair, the A7 V isn't immune to skewing, but it is considerably reduced in comparison to its predecessor, which again, coupled with the other electronic shutter benefits, make it more practical and desirable for sports and action overall. Importantly, this increased speed hasn't come at the cost of image quality. In my test, the A7 V matched the A7 IV in resolution and noise, while slightly outperforming it in dynamic range with both the mechanical and electronic shutters, at least when using the base sensitivity. The subject recognition also receives an upgrade in sophistication and accuracy, the screen enjoys a small boost in practical resolution while offering greater articulation, the auto-white balance is more refined than before, and the battery now genuinely lasts a bit longer. I didn't personally measure any improvement with the IBIS in my tests, but it still remains a very useful feature. So beyond minor annoyances like no multiple exposure modes, inexplicably slow focus bracketing, and Sony's continued speed restrictions with third-party lenses, there's not a great deal to complain about from a photography perspective. But while there are a raft of upgrades, the major improvement between the A7 V and its predecessor again involves the increased speed and practicality of the electronic shutter. If you'll regularly exploit this, say for demanding wildlife or sports situations, then I'd say it's worth spending the extra over the A7 IV. But for everyone else, the A7 IV may already be enough, while their price difference of about $800 or pounds approaches that of a decent lens. Certainly I know several A7 IV owners who see no reason to upgrade. And while it's impressive there's no compromise in image quality with this faster sensor, it is worth remembering you could bag a used Alpha 1 with 50 megapixel files from a fully stacked sensor for only a little more than a new A7 V, and that is a tempting prospect even if the autofocus and some other aspects aren't quite as refined or modern. I also wanted to mention the competition, as when you actually take the A7 V out and photograph some real life subjects side by side with key rivals, you may not see the differences that you first assumed. For example, in my test, the A7 V and Canon R6 III were actually pretty similar in terms of resolution, noise, dynamic range, and even rolling shutter despite their different sensor technologies. I also found that Canon's subject recognition was actually better for distant subjects, it had faster bursts, and was sufficiently quick at focus bracketing that you could actually attempt to do this handheld and see a stacked result in camera before you get home. But of course the R6 III isn't perfect either. There's aspects where the A7 V takes the lead, like having 14-bit RAW when using the electronic shutter, and greater customization of burst and pre-capture speeds. But the R6 III equally suffers from having its more than capable predecessor on sale at a lower price. But my point is the A7 V isn't strides ahead of its rivals. I'd rank it and the R6 III at a pretty similar level overall, and unless one model uniquely supports a feature that you really value, I'd base a decision between them on the system as a whole, particularly the price and availability of the lenses that you personally desire. And yes, while Sony, unlike Canon, allows you to use third-party lenses on full-frame bodies with autofocus, they are frustratingly limited in speed when using AFC. In order to fully enjoy the improved speed of the A7 V over the 4, you're gonna need to budget for Sony's own lenses, which isn't that much different from needing to budget for Canon's own lenses. Ultimately, while the A7 V and R6 III are both better cameras than their predecessors, most of their upgrades involve speed, and if that doesn't really bother you, then the previous versions may be good enough. Or, if you'd prefer a substantial step up in resolution, you could look out for models like, say, a used Alpha 1. If, however, you have around $2,800 or pounds to spend on a brand new camera, the A7 V becomes one of the most compelling and feature-packed models around. Sony's done a great job implementing a sensor that's faster than before without compromising quality, while also making a number of small upgrades all round that add up to a highly capable and enjoyable camera to use. Canon may have now caught up, but if you're within the Alpha system, the A7 V is a solid option for the money, and it slots comfortably in the range. And that, dear viewer, finally brings us to the end of what's turned out to be a somewhat epic-sized review. So if you've watched all of it, even across multiple sessions, well, I salute you. If you found any of it useful, please do consider giving it a like and my channel a follow, and do let me know if you'd like to see a review of the A7 V's video capabilities, or whether I should prioritise my work on an R6 III review next. These do involve around a month of work, so I can't cover everything I'd like to in this kind of detail. Thanks for watching, and thanks also to MPB for sponsoring this video and making it possible. If you have any used gear to buy, sell or trade, like an Alpha 1 perhaps, check them out at mpb.com or using the links below. Thanks again for watching, I'll see you next time, bye bye.